Hello everyone. The story I'm about to tell happened a few years ago when I worked at an old hospital in a small town near the city of Chihuahua. My name is Martina, and I am a now retired nurse. Back then, I was transferred to that hospital because it was severely understaffed. It was a small ancient government hospital that had been in poor condition for many years. Initially, this hospital was run by nuns. The first few days I worked there were somewhat difficult because there were very few working instruments, yet we received many patients daily. At that time, there were only 4 nurses besides myself, and we were overwhelmed. Thus, I began staying overnight as only another colleague and I could do so, since we didn't have children like our other colleagues. Each of us had our area, and I looked after 4 elderly adults who were under my care at night. One morning, around 2:30 a.m., I heard one of my patients calling me. I rushed to see what she needed. It was Doña Elenita, as she was affectionately called, an elderly lady there for lung issues who always needed to be connected to a nasal cannula for oxygen. When I reached her room, she had a look of terror and told me that a nun had entered her room without saying a word, her face covered with a veil, and had grabbed her wrist, squeezing it tightly. She questioned why we hired such people. The first thing I did was check her wrist, and indeed there was a large handprint marked on it. I was terrified because there were no nuns at that place and no one could enter that area at night since the door to those rooms was securely locked, and only hospital staff had access. No visitors could enter after a certain hour, so I asked her if she was sure of what she saw because in the hospital, it was just the other nurse and I, and the guards were at the reception. As I mentioned, there was no access to the rooms. She confidently affirmed what she had told me, saying that when she started screaming, the nun quickly left the room. I left there very confused. First, I went to my colleague to tell her what had happened. She was even more surprised than I was, saying she hadn't seen anyone around and that the hospital was empty. She suggested I go to the guards to ask them. So I did, but they said no one had entered the hospital and that they hadn't moved from their post at all. So if someone had entered, they would have noticed. I returned to my work, bewildered. I checked on my other patients, and they were asleep. But when I entered Doña Elenita's room again, she was without her breathing tube and had no vital signs. We couldn't do anything for her. The next day, I mentioned to the doctor what she had told me before she passed away, that someone must have removed her nasal tube. But the doctor said she was an elderly lady, and perhaps what she told me was because she was in her final moments. He suggested that maybe she had removed it herself. Regarding the mark on her wrist, he mentioned that the autopsy hadn't detected anything and told me to get over it, as Doña Elenita was in a better place and not to worry. I tried to forget it, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The following night, I went to my job as usual. That night, I only had 3 patients. I heard one of them, also an elderly gentleman, talking to someone in his room. I went to check since visits weren't allowed past 10 p.m., but when I entered, there was no one else but the gentleman. I asked him who he was talking to, and he said it was a nun who had entered to pray for him. She had stood in front of his bed, holding a rosary, without saying a word, just looking at him. Or so he thought, as he couldn't see her eyes because they were covered with a black veil. He said he had asked her who she was, but she never answered. I ran out of there to the reception where the guards were and asked if the security cameras in the hallways were working. They replied that only a few were, so I asked to see the videos. In them, we could see a tall woman dressed as a nun walking through the hospital's hallways, entering some rooms, and when she left them, her silhouette would vanish. When the guards saw that, they checked the entire hospital but found nothing. I was somewhat scared but had to return to my post. The guards told me they would be on alert and to notify them if anything happened. So I went back to the gentleman's room, but when I entered, I saw something that left me breathless. The gentleman was lifeless, with his eyes open and a rosary on his chest. When they came to collect his body, I burst into tears. I was very confused because the gentleman wasn't in serious condition. In fact, we were about to discharge him soon as he was improving. I knew it was her, the nun that patients had mentioned before dying, and who appeared in the hospital's videos. I went to talk to the doctor, but he said the autopsy showed the gentleman had died of natural causes and suggested I was suggesting myself. He even said he might have to suspend me for a few days. So, I decided not to say anything further, as I couldn't afford to be suspended. I needed the money. That night I received 2 new patients, so I had a lot of work. I couldn't neglect them because their safety was at risk. I made rounds every 10 minutes to ensure everything was in order. Nothing happened until around 3 a.m. when I passed by the room of a patient who had arrived that day. Her room light was off as she was already asleep. When I peeked through the window, I saw a large shadow standing in the corner of her room. I wanted to open the door to turn on the light, but it was locked, which was impossible since the patient couldn't get up by herself to lock it. I immediately took out my keys, but I couldn't find the one for that room. When I looked again, the shadow was moving towards the lady's bed very slowly. I can't explain the adrenaline I felt at not being able to find the key to enter and help the lady. The only thing I could do was scream, begging it not to harm her, to please leave her in peace. But the closer it got to the bed, the more it took the form of that nun with the black tunic and the veil covering her face. But when I could see her hands, I wanted to faint because they were pale with protruding purple veins, dirty, long, and neglected nails. I knew it wasn't human and had no good intentions. So, I screamed loudly for help because none of the keys would open the door, but no one heard me. I begged her to go away and not to hurt the lady, but it seemed she liked that I was watching everything. The lady woke up with my screams. When she saw the nun standing right next to her, she screamed with intense fear in her eyes. Suddenly, the nun slowly vanished on her bed, leaving her immobile with her eyes open. She had passed away. I collapsed to the floor, crying and screaming inconsolably. Why was this happening? Then my colleague came running, asking what was happening and why I was like this. I couldn't speak. I could only say that the lady had died, and that the nun had also taken her life. My colleague didn't understand what I was talking about. She opened the door as if nothing, and it was no longer locked. We both entered and turned on the light. There was the lady, lifeless in her bed, but the nun was no longer there. I couldn't stop crying. That same morning, I submitted my resignation because I couldn't handle all that pressure and no one believed me. Not even the guards who had also seen her in that video. There was no evidence that the victims had been deprived of life. All autopsies showed they died of natural causes. So, there was nothing to do. After submitting my resignation, I went to the town's church to confess because I needed to talk to someone. At that time, there wasn't psychological therapy available, at least not in that town, as it still wasn't very common. I told the priest what I had experienced. He said he believed me and was almost sure that the nun I was talking about was the Mother Superior who had led the hospital back then. He said his uncle, who was also a priest, had told him that she was a cold woman only interested in money and took advantage of her position to steal. But one day she fell ill with cancer, and it was rumored that when she was very ill, the sisters had decided to disconnect her since she had no relatives or anyone to take care of her. He believed her spirit was wandering through that hospital, taking revenge for what they had done to her because she didn't want to die. Undoubtedly a terrifying experience that made me doubt whether I should continue working. A long time ago, I worked as a nurse at a small clinic. It was a private and very expensive clinic with very few staff members. The place only had 2 floors. I worked there at night because I had to take care of my young children during the day. On that shift, it was just another nurse, the receptionist, and me. The doctor wasn't there at night unless there were emergency cases. There were very few inpatients, at most 6 people, and that was considered a lot. Among the patients at that time was an elderly woman who had been there for several days. Her kidneys were failing and she was in very poor health. Her children had her in that clinic, struggling to afford it. As I mentioned, it was a very costly place. One night, as I was making my rounds through the rooms to check that the patients were okay, I came upon a horrific scene when I entered the ladies' room. She had ended her life using a shaving razor. There was nothing we could do for her. She had no vital signs left. She left a letter for her children telling them she couldn't bear to see them struggle to pay for her illness, which she knew was incurable. So, she opted for that tragic exit. Days passed since that dark event, and one night while I was alone in the hospital cafeteria, I saw a shadow passing by the window. I couldn't see well who it was because the blinds were half closed, but I knew it was a patient because I could see their white hospital gown. I went out to see who it was, but the hallway was empty. I reached the reception, located on the same floor as the cafeteria, and asked the receptionist if she had seen any patient walking around that floor. But she said no, that nobody had passed by there. I went up to check all the patients, but they were all in their rooms that night. At that moment, my colleague, the other nurse working that shift, arrived and asked if we had a new patient. I told her no, and asked why she was asking. She looked confused and said, "Just now, when I got out of my car, I saw a patient looking out the window in one of the upstairs rooms, in that corner where the tragedy with the lady happened. That's why I found it strange, because that room hasn't been occupied since then, and I thought maybe someone had been admitted there." I told her no, that no new patients had been admitted, and in fact, I had just come from checking all the patients, and they were all asleep in their rooms. We looked at each other for a few seconds, finding no explanation. We went for a coffee while discussing what had happened. Then, the janitor, who had only been working there for a week, came in very agitated, saying there was a patient in need on the upstairs floor and urged us to hurry. We immediately ran to the second floor, but all the patients were sleeping peacefully. Somewhat annoyed, I went to talk to the janitor and reproached him for saying that, as it was not something to joke about. He looked at me surprised and swore to God it wasn't a lie. He had been mopping the hallway on the second floor when at the end, he saw an elderly woman standing with her wrists bleeding, crying and lamenting. That's why he ran to tell us, as he didn't know what to do. My colleague and I looked at each other without saying a word. She told the janitor it was okay, not to worry, and thanked him for letting us know before letting him go. Then she touched my shoulder and said, "It's her, the lady from that tragic day who ended her life." I truly refused to believe in that. But what other explanation was there? After that night, we kept seeing someone, a woman, peeking out of the window of that room every time my colleague and I arrived at night. Some of our patients also mentioned seeing an elderly woman walking through the hallways from the window of their room. They often called us to say that a patient needed help because she was wandering the hallways crying. The patients thought it was someone admitted there, as they didn't know the story of that elderly lady. We just thanked them for letting us know but never told them the reality. We didn't want to scare them. It became more customary for us to see her peeking through the window, or for our patients to tell us they had seen her walking through the hospital hallways. It was a tormented soul who had ended in a very tragic manner, and her soul couldn't find rest. After a few years, I moved to another city but kept in touch with my colleague who, over the years, told me that the elderly lady was still trapped there and that she believed she would never leave. That room had to be turned into a storage room for cleaning products because no one could stand staying there for a single night due to the paranormal occurrences. Patients who had stayed there reported that at night, an elderly lady would watch them from the corner of the room but then disappear. Thank you for listening to my experience. Good night, everyone.